And thank you everyone for coming. I hope the weather wasn't too bad for some of you. Tonight we're celebrating the publication of Greg Freeman's pamphlet, The Fall of Singapore. We also welcome two guest poets, Aileen Ballantyne and Anthony Owen. Greg probably needs very little introduction from me because you're all aware of the excellent work he does as news editor, promoting poetry and poets on writeoutloud.net. And many of you have enjoyed reading at the nights he hosts together with Rodney Wood at the Lightbox in Woking and on Zoom. We published Marples Must Go, Greg's first full collection last year. This is a very different collection tonight, which is created to mark the 80th anniversary of the Allied surrender at Singapore to numerically inferior Japanese forces, which led to thousands of deaths of prisoners of war and local workers forced to build the infamous Burma-Thailand Death Railway. And Greg has used the memories of his own father, who was a railway survivor, alongside his poems. So without saying much more about this, because I'm sure that Greg has a lot to say himself, I'm going to hand over to Greg. He will be reading 3 sections of his collection, and with readings by Aileen and Anthony between them. So Greg, would you like to unmute, and everybody else, please stay muted. And we'll hear from Greg and the Fall of Singapore.
Put it onto...
Thanks very much, Janice. And a big thank you to Dempsey and Windle, who were willing to publish this pamphlet so soon after Marples Must Go, and turned it around so swiftly that it came out within a week of the 80th anniversary of the surrender at Singapore. A big thank you as well to my 2 guest poets, Aileen Ballantyne and Anthony Owen, who both contributed warm endorsements for this book and who have shown themselves in different ways to be poets that have a real understanding of conflict. I'm so grateful for the continuing support of them both in this project. We look forward to hearing from both of them later. And welcome to all you here tonight, including anyone from the Far East Prisoners of War Facebook group that has been so helpful and supportive to me in the last few weeks. The genesis of this book can be traced back to the late 1980s, early 90s. My father died in 1989. For years, I'd scribbled down his late night recollections. I always wanted to tell his story. And after his death, I went to the Imperial War Museum and gained access to many former POWs' accounts of their experiences. But it wasn't until I returned to writing poetry again from 2004 onwards that I found a way of putting it all into words. So 4 poems about my father were included in my first pamphlet collection, Train Spotters. 2 years ago, on the 45th anniversary of VJ Day, I posted 1 or 2 of them online, and one of my guests tonight, Aileen Ballantyne, suggested I publish them as a sequence. And it was only late last year that I realized the 80th anniversary of Singapore was fast approaching, and that this could be my best chance of finally getting my father's story definitively into print. I had in my back pocket, as it were, a number of other poems with wartime settings that I've grouped together in this same collection. And almost immediately with the invasion of Ukraine, several of those poems have taken a grim new relevance and significance. But the first poem is about my father and takes us straight into the middle Singapore section of the collection. A Job on the Railways is about his fairly happy-go-lucky, carefree life before the war, but the coming of war is there in the background. A Job on the Railways. My dad never planned to go very far. After larking about on bookshop errands, he joined his father's line of work. His pa was well thought of, goods foreman, 9 Elms. Dad looked forward to regular earnings. The call of the empire, he had no dreams. Hitler bluffed his way into the Rhineland. Dad was shunted one stop to another, caged in ticket offices, free in mind as Metroland spider extended its web. Japan pounced, moved south from Manchuria. Dad spotted birds, knew he'd found the right job. Puzzling over charges for livestock and parcels, stationery and sidings at Stoneleigh, Claygate, Oxshott, Motspur Park. Free travel to travel home free ticket to travel home at night safe, played piano at parties, skated at Streatham. Work on the railways was a paid-up life. Stayed in on Saturday nights to catch Al Bowley leading the Savoy big bands. Far away smile, listening to that voice. He didn't hear the sounds of breaking glass. And this is the title poem of the collection. I must have a slug of water. Excuse me. Which opens the main sequence in the book, The Fall of Singapore. Imagine it as the Isle of Wight, same size and shape, but with mangrove swamps, jungle, plantations, golf courses, swimming clubs, all barred to conscripts. One club wouldn't let Singapore's defenders chop down some trees to improve the line of fire. Fool's paradise. They parted almost to the end at Raffles Hotel. My father's ship was bombed as it sailed in. Repulse, Prince of Wales, sunk 2 months before. Australian soldiers asked them, brought any planes? If not, you might as well fuck off. My dad, who signed up as a pay clerk to keeping out of the infantry, was handed a gun as soon as he arrived. He didn't get to use it. Britain's imperial bluff had been called. Few defences had been built on the landward side. The fortress guns could only fire seawards. Churchill claims in his memoirs that he was only belatedly informed. He decreed that the fight by the multinational army of Britons, Indians, Australians and Malays must continue until the bitter end against a force they outnumbered by 3 to 1. Pretense, irresolution, incompetence, complacency for many years. Indian troops said the days of the British Raj were over. Australians prowled the streets, their commanders sneaked away by boat. A taste of things to come, an invading army that didn't play by the rules. Staff and patients bayoneted at the Alexandra Hospital, one on the operating table. Churchill had the chance to divert the forces, the ship that contained my father, to Burma. The war leader's memoirs say, there is no doubt what a purely military decision should have been, but Australia demanded reinforcements. The 18th British Division went forward on its way. Churchill's chapter on Singapore concludes, General Percival was advised by his senior commanders that of the two alternatives, counterattack or surrender, the first was beyond the capacity of his exhausted troops. Percival was photographed marching to the headquarters of the invaders under a flag of truce, the largest surrender in British military history. An empire humbled, the white man humiliated. A troop ship from Greenock, a photograph of my father and his 2 pals in a rickshaw in tropical kit, on shore leave in Durban, smiling broadly on their way to Singapore. This next poem is a found poem from a Japanese account of their progress down the Malayan Peninsula, which resulted in the capture of Singapore. And it's called Depend on the Enemy for Rations. Depend on the enemy for rations. We were taught from school days to prepare for war and expect to die. We were miners, expecting rough work. Yet we landed without hindrance from sea or air. The weak-spirited enemy thought the jungle impossible. Our plan? To attack the Westerners without pause, never give them a chance to regroup or dig in, adjust and adapt, advancing on bicycles. We worried that a few days' rice and dry bread were all we had, but depend on the enemy for rations, our commander said. He was right. Forever retreating, the British left us field guns, heavy machine guns, trucks, armoured cars, enough provisions for 3 months. The airfields we captured were often back in the service of the Emperor within half a day. Thank you, Mr. Churchill, we often said. At Singapore, they were more than us. We did not know why they laid down their arms, but we spat on them and called them cowards. Now, my father didn't talk much about his wartime experiences when we were children, but he did try to explain how he managed to survive mentally the horrific conditions as a prisoner of war working on the Death Railway. He remembered the Wordsworth poem about daffodils that he had to learn by heart at school, and in particular, the words, "that inward eye." That phrase helped him take him away from where he was to memories of family and home, which sustained him. The poem also mentions the random death of one of his pals, Taffy, while working on the railway, that changed his attitude towards life and death. "It's the law of the jungle, son," he used to repeat to me with fierce conviction. "None of us matter at all." Learning by heart. It was that time of year. There would be daffodils at home beside hedges glowing in the rain. Labouring in the cutting, he saw them dancing. A poem they'd been schooled to learn by heart, an inward eye. That was the trick. A railway journey back to Rains Park shut out the darkness, the despair of Hellfire Pass. Once, in entire darkness, in weather that would have drowned daffodils, they camped in a paddy field beside the railway. Sodden voices in harmony through the rain. Those Liverpool Irish boys lifted his heart, helped him escape to Streatham Rink, dancing, polished ice, swish and hiss. He guided her dancing, escorted the girl from the office through the darkness. She allowed him to caress her, feel her heart beating. He found himself thinking of daffodils. Taffy, why was he running? Slid in the rain, fell onto slashed bamboo, ruptured spleen. The railway snatched another life. Impossible, military, slave, railway. After each downpour, mosquitoes dancing. Best pal, married on leave, perished in the rain. 1 week joking, next week dead. This darkness in which no one matters. Bloody daffodils, look out for number one, sir. Hardened heart. Speedo, bashings, indifference at the heart of everything. Picks, shovels, railway driving onwards. He bought his mother daffodils, heard her laugh out loud, saw her dancing to the radio. You are my sunshine in the darkness. Lullabies drowned by the thunder of the rain hitting the ATAP huts. Relentless rain seeping into bones as they lay there. Hearts groaning, a life for every sleeper. Ravenous darkness. He'd whiled away time in a faraway railway ticket office. Now they were dancing to another tune. Did Tokyo have daffodils, nourished by Japanese rain? A job on the railways. Don't dare lose heart. See those comrades dancing in the darkness. A crazy gang of golden daffodils. As I said, I researched a lot of veterans' accounts at the Imperial War Museum shortly after my father died. And one observation particularly struck me, that food quickly replaced sex as the POW's main fantasy, and that eating became a private function rather than a communal one. Eating in private. It wasn't long before food replaced sex in their fantasies. Conjuring carvings of roast beef became a nightly reflex. Rice cakes, dished up by Scots guards, suggested imaginings of meat. So they told tales. Lancashire hot pot, black pudding. Starving men lusted for shepherd's pie, digested air raid, all clear stew in their jungle jail. Cafes and corner houses, bangers, mash, bacon and eggs. Drooled, slavered, licked lips. Captives with stick legs, sores, ulcers, slashes on backs, saw it as a private function, turned away from each other, hunched, ashamed. savoured each morsel and hanged fellowship, took dead men's rations without compunction. When bellies were emptied, morals were maimed. Could a mate be counted as a true friend when you secretly wished him too ill to eat his meal? Harsh dividend of comradeship. They witnessed boys turning into old men, heads shrinking, teeth growing, pelvis and thigh bones standing out until their bodies bore red, raw marks, yearning for a proper Beano, eyes dimly glowing. This next poem, The Engineer's Tale, is another found poem taken from a Japanese account of the building of the railway. The Engineer's Tale. Speedo was the word. Tokyo had the timetable hurried forward to aid the Burma front. In June, monsoon at its height, day after day, rain impeded the work, filling up cuttings, flashing out roadbeds, threatening trestle bridges. Cholera and dysentery reduced the POWs and coolies, so wages were cut. The elephants wouldn't work after their mahouts died. The single track ran for 300 miles through cliff-hanging jungle. The British surveyed it, said it was impossible. We tried to stay close to the river. Enemy raids forced trains to run at night. Some took 3 days to complete the route. Most of the bombed bridges were rebuilt in a week. 20 were hit in 1 day. The line was rushed. There were many derailments, lives lost, sacrifices, prisoners fell from bridges, died in many places. Yet, I will never forget our proudest hour, October 1943, when the tracks from Burma and Thailand met. 2 commanders drove special spikes into a sleeper, and the national anthem played. And this next poem is also a found poem based on letters from my grandmother to my father after she heard he was alive, that I discovered while clearing out my mother's flat in 2011. I hardly knew my grandmother as a child, and I felt I was hearing her voice, her relief and excitement for the first time in these letters, and it was a profoundly moving moment. Liberation, 1945. To Private W.E. Freeman, recovered POW Centre, Bombay, Indian Command. Dearest son, after all this long time, we are so excited, we hardly know what to do. It seems so strange to be able to write. So many letters via War Office, Red Cross. When she heard he was safe, she sent 3 in a week. Some camps seem to have fared better than others. I still tried to think your luck would hold. You were missing 15 months before I heard you were in Jap hands. Mrs. Smith heard this June that Taffy, as you used to call him, died in June 1943. She still hopes they have made a mistake. We will make it up to you as far as it is in our powers. Last year we had a bad hit, but we were lucky. The house was much damaged, but our furniture was safe. Also your piano. Do you know, I'm getting on now. 63 this birthday. Pop says it doesn't seem true. I do so wonder how you will be after all this time in the terrible heat. There was bunting down the street when he returned. He hid indoors for days. Thank you. That concludes my first set of poems. And now I'd like to welcome Aileen Ballantyne as my first guest reader. And this is a very great pleasure indeed. Aileen and I were colleagues on The Guardian in the 1980s. She a reporter, I a sub-editor. And now we are both fellow poets. Her debut collection, Taking Flight, which includes a sequence about the Lockerbie disaster, on which she reported at the time, displays, in my view, how much the skills of journalism can be employed in poetry. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Greg, and thank you for those amazingly moving poems. Documentary poems, I think, was what we had in common with the way that we both decided to approach poetry after journalism. So this first one is very much a documentary poem. It started life in the military section of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. This is the skull with the soft fontanelles that grew long ago in the womb of a woman and pushed its way down and was blessed. These are the sockets of eyes in the face of a boy who tilled the green field. Here are the splinters of bone in the hole where his song spilled out onto grass. And what really brought that poem about was just being in that museum and looking at a human skull and just thinking, fairly certain it was from several centuries ago, but I did wonder who, if anyone, had given permission and whose son it was. And the next poem is based on the story of Rose Gentle and her son, Jamie, if you remember, around about 2004. She was campaigning for more safety for the troops during the war in Iraq and how poorly protected they were. And her son, who was about 18 at the time, was killed. And it happened to be about the same time as the anniversary of the Battle of Flodden. So this is in fact set in Hoyk, a town I know well. The flowers of the forest, Jamie. That's his kit bag lying there. I wonder if his shirt's folded square. I was here to turn his collar down. He's got that lad and lanky cutting grass and digging gardens. The early recruiters looked that smart, stunning by the horse on the cross. They let him feel the weft of the gun, felt him there was mair than cutting grass and digging gardens. Offered him a trade, said he'd see the world, wear the black cock feather. That's his kit bag. The officer brought it. He said, Jamie fell the honour. He said I couldn't see him, couldn't touch his hair or turn his collar down. And I showed him the garden Jamie dug, the ground, that brown and empty, waiting for the flowers. And this poem takes us into the Second World War and is based on an actual account, which I found. It's called The Witness, an old man's voice. Geraniums. I remember the terracotta pots that held the geraniums and the smell of new paint on the windows and walls when they cut off her hair that day. The girls and the woman smelled the paint smell and it calmed them. Naked and quiet, they laid clothes and shoes by the pots that held the geraniums. Testimony. When it was done, they took long wooden poles, each with a curved metal hook, pulled each body in by piercing its mouth. The dentist came then to tear out gold teeth. I considered some time before watching at Belzec that day to write up my hygiene report. I could not conclude, on that day at least, that bodies were disposed of in a sanitary way. In the museum, the voices run on a loop. An old woman with numbers on her arm, talking of ripples and pools, circles subsiding, memory a stone in its depth now. I could not see clearly that day. Steam missed the peephole. I look through the glass now at the things we left behind. Broken glass from the cold beer we drank, a pot for cooking, a bowl for a dress, grey buttons and spoons, the red Bakelite thimble on the finger of the fair-haired girl, broken now, cracked by a stone or a foot, like the petals of geraniums. And this next one is one of the Lockerbie poems that Greg mentioned. And it's written almost like a spell as an introduction, because it's 32 years on now. And yet Lockerbie, which, if we think about it, was, however horrific it was one town that had a terrorist attack executed upon it completely out of the blue. And it's probably the only experience we'll ever have of what's, in a tiny way, of what's going on in Ukraine, and the links and the connections that have happened between people in the 30 years since that happened have been extraordinary. And I suppose it's one of the things that we all become aware of, which is, you know, the kindness of strangers that people talk about often in a warlike situation, or in this case, a terror situation. The wishing gate, look beneath my gravestone through the keeky hole, when the round's laden, when the summer's done, a skein of geese have in me, the green leaves wildered gold, divna come in warm July, come at winter's chill, loose the boat aside the loch, see the fire is set, and touch the silvered lichen with the wishing gate. Rescue worker, 21st December 1988. He can see them where he found them, lit by the beam of the torch on his forehead, untouched, it seemed, by the fall. He hoped they had slept, but knew they had not. Those two young women he found in the dark field that December night, still strapped to their plane seats, their arms tight around each other, their fingers crossed. After the plane fell, the bodies and the belongings of the dead simply lay around the streets and the gardens of Lockerbie for several days. It was Christmas. And the whole area for miles around became a crime scene, which was why I wrote the first poem called The Wishing Gate, because it did feel, as I got to know people in Lockerbie, that people were desperately searching for something, searching for answers, searching for some last information. Sometimes there was a body, sometimes there wasn't. But what I found particularly extraordinary about it was the way that people saw anybody that fell and that had to be left for several days as my son, or that's my boy. It was like they were connecting in this rather strange way. And later that seemed to move on to the possessions. The women of the town decided to return these possessions that had been strewn around, which in many cases were all that was left for people. They succeeded. This poem's just called Toothpaste. It was the toothpaste that nearly defeated them. It was there in each suitcase. Each tube had exploded over every shirt and blouse they tried to mend, but one washed, one ironed, and one folded, until each trace of the blast, of blood and of fuel was removed. And at last, after 7 years of waiting, the clothes of each son, of each daughter, were returned to each mother, to each father, and the unread pages of a journal of a girl who lived to 20 were unfolded leaf by leaf, ironed one by one, her words returned, clean and washed in their pages. From just one short poem to finish with, which I suppose is about the wonder of travel, which we all hope that some of the world will open up for us again. This is Starlings in Flight, Murmurations. Here they are in Rome. Knowledge of starlings, stormwoody stormy. Allegretto, adagio, accelerando, capriccioso. The starlings of Rome know them all as they write their cantatas in clear winter skies. At Stazioni Termini today, 500,000 winged grace notes fly to the rhythm of an unseen conductor, form a panther, a bell jar, a tree. Tomorrow, at Piazza Cinquecento, a lion, a stingray, a fish, a murmuration that twists, folds the strands of a double helix to a hand in the heavens that tumbles and turns to a solid black cloud that covers the sun, and never a collision in the rhythm of their time.
Thank you very much. They were lovely poems. The murmuration one, the last one you read, was it was like music. And the Lockerbie one's very, very moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice.
And now we're going to go back to listen to another section of Greg's book. So Greg, are you ready?
I certainly am. I'd just like to echo my thanks to Aileen for those wonderful, understated and detailed and sensitive poems. Thanks so much, Aileen. I'd like to begin my second set with this poem, Black Gold, which is simply a portrait of my father's happy life in retirement before he developed dementia, when he talked to me about his wartime experiences when I came to visit. The final line refers to him dancing a jig while eating a banana. My wife, Gillian, took a photo of him doing exactly that. Black Gold. Their bungalow seemed to grow out of the ground. The garden was big enough to lose himself in, while grandchildren marched importantly in and out of sheds. Dad took me on a tour of his empire that terminated at the compost bins, ran leaf mold through his fingers, exulting at what he'd created, the miracle of degradation, black gold. It's life that matters, son, he used to say with urgency. Late at night, he spoke of wartime captivity, reckoning I'd reached an age to understand. Laughed at the way Mum played Monopoly. Tears coursed his cheeks. Once, when Match of the Day came on, while eating a banana, he danced a jig. I won't say anything more about this next poem. It's called The River. A pleasure boat run down by a dredger. That Sunday morning of keen sunshine, the helicopters were still scouring the river on the train ride to his bedside. Disaster after disaster in the final years of Our Lady. Fever of cutting corners, blaming others, failure to keep a good lookout, flashing lanterns, luring the unwary onto rocks. That same Sunday, he was released after years in captivity. I closed his eyes. As the fog descended, he had returned again and again to his fear of having to pay to call out the doctor. Sometimes he believed he was back on rice rations under guard of the Japanese. In his last months, all he could recite was daffodils, word perfect, and the name of the Prime Minister. It was almost 20 years after my father died that we found ourselves in Bangkok and able to take a train journey to Kanchanaburi, to the war cemetery pictured on the front cover of this collection, and to the rebuilt bridge over the River Kwai. On that same trip that included Australia and Hong Kong, I learned of my first poem to be published, a poem about Munich that had been accepted by the poetry magazine South, a milestone moment for me. I've never realised the coincidence of those two events, the trip to the River Kwai, the news of my first poem publication, until I was preparing for this reading a few days ago. Train to the Kwai Bridge. Bananas, palms, rice fields. Jolting train takes 3 hours from Bangkok. Jet tired, we get out at the stop before. Taxi tout spots our bewilderment, whisks us away for a crazy sum. We pay him off, shake off his guided tour. The train still runs over rebuilt spans. You take a picture to show my mum. I walk across along the tracks. David Lean, Alec Guinness, Hollywood version for a post-war audience. Wind in the middle. Try to imagine it. Look down at the water through the gaps. Back in the town, a new museum restores faces to the cemetery rows. We always fought about socialism. He talked about the jungle, knowing what men could do. Singapore, surrender. Monsoon, disease. Beriberi, cholera, malaria, dysentery. That's when I lose it, writing in the visitor's book. My father worked on this railway. And the final poem of my shortish second set is included in part in deference to my next guest poet, as I know he admires it. It's called Cherry Blossom. Unknown soldier abandoned in the mud and blood, his boots miraculously still gleaming, leather guarded against weather, demand blossomed on the Western Front. Boots on the ground, GIs found that Tokyo girls they took a shine to weren't swept off their feet, blamed their lack of polish, their rough, scuffed look. But it was much, much more than that. Not just what it said on the tin, its fish plate opener, the superficial sheen. Occupying Japanese soldiers often planted cherry trees. Temperate zone of the Northern Hemisphere, drinking sake under the branches. Militaristic plotters assumed the name. Suicidal pilots painted them on the sides of planes. The blossoms symbolized clouds in a nation's culture. Oh, what a cloud. And such brightness. Shadows left on walls. The ephemerality of lives. Thank you. Now, I've known Anthony Owen as a poet for a number of years, and indeed interviewed him more than once for Write Out Loud, the most recent instance being asking him about the renewed nuclear threat from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Anthony is a peace poet who manages to write lyrical, beautiful poetry about moments of great horror, such as the atom bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, having gone there to talk to survivors. He is from Coventry, which was badly bombed in the Second World War. And I feel honoured that he feels a kinship between my volume of poetry and his work, between us both as poets. Please welcome Anthony Owen.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you, and congrats to you, Greg, on a great collection. And you know, it's such a privilege to be at your launch, because writing peace education poetry, and I would put you in that kind of sort of section, in the sense that you are educating people through this book, through the generations. I went to Hiroshima as a result of a gentleman called John Hartley, who was stationed there in the 50s, and since COVID hit, unfortunately, he's now suffered from dementia because he wasn't able to go out and actually keep cognitively sort of active. So we're custodians of these people, these very special people that went through an extraordinary experience. It doesn't matter whether they're Japanese or German or Russian, or they're human beings. And the first poem I'm gonna read is the title poem, Nagasaki Elder, and it was partly inspired by Sueko Hada, who interviewed and heard testimony from for over an hour. She couldn't cry for 25 years because she had the atom bomb affected her tear ducts, so she couldn't actually even cry. So she sort of was always in a state of permanent sadness that she couldn't actually extinguish those flames by even grieving for her loved ones. But this is about the strength of the women who are very rarely written about in conflict. And it's very, very often that women will share their testimonies through conflicts. This is the Nagasaki elder. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Her first son was silent, as if refusing to weep from that beautiful slum. The still yellow flower of Nagasaki took 9 months to bloom. Her first kiss was black rain, writing tragic symphonies on song sheet glass. Her father is the boogeyman, haunted by his own slivered face. Her first period was jelly. The shift mothers came trained to hold survivors. Do not say a word to the handsome doctor who writes for your blood. Her feet clockwise, reshaping her family with Nagasaki clay. She said, "This is how water should feel." So just to give you an idea of the temperature on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it's about 5,000 degrees Celsius. In Herculaneum and Pompeii, well, mainly Herculaneum before the pyroclastic flow hit Pompeii, they found the bodies of people in Herculaneum with holes in their skulls because it was about 1,000 degrees Celsius, so 5,000 degrees Celsius on the surface temperature of Hiroshima. And it exploded 582 meters above the ground. And she was 8 years old. And she said to me, "I wasn't cruel to prisoners of war." It's absolutely crazy that we blame people still for the sins of a nation on the few. So the next poem I'm going to read, I'm going to dedicate to my friend Rainer, who is an extraordinary man and editor. And I went over to Dresden in the autumn last year to launch this book at the Frauenkirche, which was bombed by the Allied bombing. And it's a beautiful place there, the old stone with the new ornate marble. And yeah, this is for you, Rainer. So, a German soldier in Russian boots. Comrade, your thigh meat tasted like game and leather. I needed your boots, so hung you over a fire to loosen them. Your winters are so cold that my piss comes out like red fire. Comrade, your eyes have thawed and it looks like you're crying. Wolves are lapping the chummed snow and I feel nothing. I am tame to them. Their numbers expand like gunmetal. Comrade, did you know old German newspapers blow all over Russia? They come from trench coats of furious phantoms. Your winter shall win you this war come summer. It's so cold that I shot the oil from a panzer and made myself a skin. My crimes are safe behind my perfect sky blue eyes. Aryan boys die like dogs, live white as statue. Comrade, I defiled your body because I needed your boots. I hacked into the ice with my blade like you were meat, and you were meat. You were my footsteps home. It's so typical that I am to die beneath the Soviet sickle moon. My cause of death, a toe that slowly gnawed my left leg. Comrade, this motherland is full of brothers in arms. And they're very dark poems, but I'm so angry about what's going on at the moment in Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, but how we memorialize people and how we have this kind of like Premier League of sufferance. You know, this has been going on a lot in Yemen, where the British government sold £5 billion worth of arms deals to the Saudis, and this superiority of white Western grief has to stop. We have to look at people as human beings. My next collection is called The Battle. It's out in about a month's time for Mental Health Awareness Week. When I was 15 years old, I tried to commit suicide. And a few years ago, I came close. And actually, the research into the book Nagasaki Elder was partly to do with that feeling as an adult. In 2020, 5,224 people committed suicide, and 75% of them were men, with the majority of those in the age ratio of 43 to 49, according to the Office of National Statistics. I'm very passionate that men have to speak up about mental health, and I'm taking a few risks this year, both in my job, raising money for Mind voluntarily to do a case study on men through workplace who deal with toxic health and culture in the workplace, and also adult autism, which is largely undiagnosed, which I've been waiting for now for 3.5 years. So the first poem tonight I'm going to read from that is called When Men Mansplain to Men. When men mansplain to men. A man once told me I would never make it as a serious poet. He said, beware, Kerouac was a drunk and a dreamer. I immediately read Kerouac. A poet once I should go to an Arvon class to learn poetry. The following year, I went to Hiroshima instead. I saw Kerouac on sale, translated into kanji. The next poem I'm going to read is Winter of 1987. Snowfall at 14 is like a first kiss. I remember watching the factory turn to Care Paravel, the halogen lights of Scandinavian cars aglow like Turkish delight. And either winter of 1987 was like God took a shotgun to the angels, their dirty feathers befelling the pure adolescents, trying their best to avoid the lie in cage. I thought of digging myself an igloo and drifting away from Nurofen. 3 months later, I would swallow them like snowflakes, pinning my down like tawny icicles my unmaker made. Snow makes everything new for a while, like a liar's promise. You melt away into those you place you dream. I was a boy inside a wolf that lost its song. When my daughter comes of age, we shall dissect the snowman, and I shall show her his DNA is made from hands deformed. We shall toss the carrot and the hat into the brook and hug. I've got 2 more poems, which we'll read. And the next one's going to be the hotel I planned to kill myself in, which was actually based on a few years ago. Everything in this poem is how it was in 2017. My suicide note was going to be a timed email scheduled to send the moment I became born. I had hoped to trick God this way, to swallow spring water with pills, leave a part of me pure for hell. My suicide was going to be in a rundown hotel, yet the sun would have risen on my cold body, and moon would have kissed me goodnight. I'd planned a Spotify list to listen to drift off into the woodwind place, thinking of faces I loved. My second suicide note was to the chambermaid. They would have found me all twisted up like a lightning tree disgracing wind. They would have needed therapy. 5 minutes to turn the room. We all have targets to meet. My wife saved me with her ears taking this all in. The colour from her face slid into the nothing. The tears from her eyes fell into full stops. Beat from her heart, sprinting to save me from the other me. And I shall finish off with why some people can't forgive suicide. This is the hardest poem in the book to write in a battle, because I wanted it to be balanced on consequences of an attempted suicide and how that affects people. So yeah, without further ado, so I'm just trying to find it here. In 2016, I worked for a company for 7 years, and I lost a friend, a poet, and she committed suicide. I went into work, and the sales manager said, what's up with you today? You've got a fucking cob on. And I said, my friend committed suicide over Christmas. And she said, did she, the one with a child? I said, yes. And she said, I've no sympathy for your friend who killed herself. She had a kid, for fuck's sake. I took her to the boss and demanded he do something about it. And I was made redundant on my birthday. And it's the first time I have worked. This is the poem, though. I remember as if her kit started to then rip her apart. I learnt that night how certainty is sting like pretty hemlock. That night, retching up cocaine, I felt the embers of my mum's lifeline standing over me, wiping casserole chicken from my chin. Later, I saw her feet kissing at my door, a cracked breath. I remember my little brother's child eyes, rash red from weeping. His slow-mo words I tried to block out. He grew up that day, and that was my murder. Looking back, I remember my father in the mist of his moped, dragging the laments of factory life with him to my bones. We camped there for a while in the wigwam of our skin. I remember our first day back at school to news of my failure, my best friend's throats following the weight of unmanly grief. I never spoke a word about it until we thought we were men. I loved them more than ever, yet after I was lost even more. Going through his suicide provokes the inner ghost. It's just a pause, and one day the Ouija touch may summon it. And I get why people cannot forgive suicide. There is no answer. There is no answer to being incapable of joy and pain. There is no answer to a normal day. Then we act. I read of a wife who found her husband hung in a garage. She described him as a pendulum stopping time itself. 10 years on, she wants to forgive, but cannot. I get why some people ghost the demons that haunt them. As a son, I was the elephant in the room and circus. And now as a father, I know how it is to be child and ghost, and how in the perfect circle of my unlit seance, I walk out into the circle and into the world. Forgive no one, nor ask for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was all very, very moving. It did break up a bit. I'm not sure that the video is going to be very good. I think your connection was quite loose, but they were lovely poems. Thank you. And now we're going again to Greg. Greg, would you like to read again?
Yes, thanks very much, Anthony. I like to think of the occasional moments of breakup as dramatic pauses, and it's an amazing reading. Thank you. I've 4 poems remaining in my final set. The first one is that poem I referred to earlier, the one about Munich that I heard would be published when I was out in the Far East. It's called Heston Aerodrome, and it's about Neville Chamberlain's return from Munich. There's been a film out about all that recently, and it's a return flight seen through the eyes of the girlfriend of the pilot of Chamberlain's plane. Heston Aerodrome. Waiting alone, far from politicians and press, shouting of news she doesn't understand, posters of gas masks, digging trenches in parks, waiting for the plane from Munich to land. There's something about him, not like the others, steady, careful, you expect that by rights, but dashing too. She wants him home, safe. Something tricky about this flight. Plane door opens, big cheeses rush forward. Patching up their quarrel is her only cause. A man with a moustache prances down the steps clutching some paper. There's a round of applause. The paper flutters like a dove trying to fly. Words she remembers. long after his climb to heaven in the same month, 2 years on. Sudetenland, Chancellor, peace for our time. She'll wed him, throw caution to the wind. It springs up as the cockpit door opens, the first chill of autumn. Thinking back, there must have been hundreds raising a cheer. Years later, precious few claimed, I was there. Second one is about Hitler's insistence that France's surrender in 1940 be signed in the same railway carriage where Germany signed the armistice in 1918. It refers to a misfits moment of revenge. And I thought recently of another dictator seeking reparations for historic losses. But there can be no excuses, not even geopolitical ones, for war crimes and genocide, then or now, even if he claims he's being persecuted by the woke brigade like J.K. Rowling. The carriage in the forest. After 3 days of arguing, the armistice was signed in the French general's private train at a siding in the forest of Compiègne. The Kaiser left her exile in Holland. The military, unwilling to admit defeat, still surrendered guns and planes. No one told the people how bad things were. A German corporal, recovering after being gassed the month before, a misfit whose life only made sense in the trenches, blamed surrender on socialists and revolutionaries, treacherous tricksters. Germany hadn't really lost at all. Comrades had regarded him as weird, sat in a corner of the mess on his own, didn't care about leave or women, received no letters or parcels from home. The railway carriage, displayed in Paris, returned to the forest where it remained. When World War resumed, with swagger and swastikas, the corporal received France's surrender among the trees in the same compartment. The misfits' moment of revenge. Actually, I'm going to finish with this last poem, which is the last poem in the collection, and it does attempt to end on a note of optimism. The ample mansion means little traffic light man and is the symbol shown on pedestrian signals in Germany before German reunification in 1990. The two German states had different forms for the ample mansion, with a generic human figure in West Germany and a generally male figure wearing a hat in the East. In this case, the East German version became the accepted symbol, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a popular tourist souvenir item. I was charmed by it on our visit to Berlin in 2015, at a time of optimism when Chancellor Angela Merkel had said that waves of refugees crossing Europe who were facing hostility and rejection as they passed through other countries would be welcomed in Germany. And recently, Berlin has again been at the forefront of making refugees from Ukraine welcome. Even a Syrian refugee who found sanctuary in Germany 7 years ago came forward to offer a home to Ukrainians. That kind of thing makes me cry, but in a good way. Thank you all for coming and listening to our poetry tonight. I wish us all peace, but let's also hope that Ukraine wins its fight against its oppressor. The Little Green Man of Berlin. They were glad enough to see so much thrown in the dustbin when the wall came down, but not the ample mansion, the traffic light's little green man with his jaunty Erich Honecker hat. At the threat of his deposal by the West staid cousin, there was outcry. Now, Herr Everyman's cheery gait sets Berlin's tone on carrier bags, coffee mugs, T-shirts. Beside the Reichstag and Brandenburg Gate, he doffs his hat respectfully amid Germany's blackened history, offering normality even as teenagers racket among Holocaust memorial slabs. The hat's raised also to solemn Marx and Engels, acknowledging their good intentions. Shaded by trees, the statues' hands and feet still burnished by nostalgia and wishful thinking, as the city goes briskly about its business, past filling stations where border posts and watchtowers once stood. He beckons. What's that he's saying? Forget the barbed wire, the places that sent you. Your journey's over. Willkommen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Fantastic finish too.